Today I've got for you guys the updated best Apex Legends settings for Season 18 to achieve the maximum balance of FPS and visibility whilst keeping your input latency as low as possible. So I'm here in the firing range. We've got all of our settings set at default. We're going to begin in the video area today. Starting with display mode, you want to make sure this is on full screen. A lot of people I know like using borderless window, but I will say this in every settings video I do. Borderless window will affect your input latency in a negative way. It makes it so that your PC isn't giving all of its resource to the game whilst it's open. Whilst full screen, it does give it all that resource. So even though your FPS might feel similar and you can alt-tab a bit easier in borderless window, full screen is going to give you that better input latency. Aspect ratio will be a bit of a debated topic. If you want the game to feel as natural as possible and like a lot of other FPSs you might be playing, then native 16:9 is going to be your best bet. It's going to give you the very standard aspect ratio to the game. Nothing's going to look stretched in any way. However, a lot of people on this game specifically do like running a 16:10 resolution. You'll have one of these options down here. Just pick whichever the highest one you've got is. You'll see when I apply this, we get a slightly stretched look. It basically makes the enemies look a little bit fatter. It can make it a little bit easier to identify targets and stay on target when you start shooting. But it's kind of personal preference. I personally like sticking with 16:9. Just go try both out and see which one you prefer. For the resolution, if you're using the native aspect ratio, then you want your resolution to also be native. For me, it's 1440p, so this is 2560 by 1440. You guys might be on 1080p, so yours would be 1920 by 1080. If you are running the 16:10, as I said, just put it at the max. Brightness, by default, it's at 50%. In pretty much every FPS that I play, I always turn up to 55%. I just find that little increase in brightness tends to help a little bit with visibility, helps in some of those dark areas of the map. For your FOV or field of view, you want to make sure this is at least 100. This is just going to give you that little bit of extra information to your left and your right in your peripherals. You know, I can spot the enemy all the way on the right there, whereas I wouldn't on lower FOV. Honestly, I would recommend you put this at 110 unless you really don't like how small the enemies start getting. It just makes you feel like you're moving a ton quicker. And also, later on in this video, I'll actually show you how you can go above 110 all the way to a 120 FOV that the game does actually support. You just can't do it with in-game. You have to do it in a config file. I'll show you that later on. FOV ability scaling, we want to make sure this is disabled. What this would do if we had it on is it makes it so that abilities like Octane's run, his speedy ability, it makes it so that he gets more FOV when he turns that on. And in this game, having different FOVs changes your sensitivity. So it would make it so that you basically can't get consistent aim when that FOV is changing. It's not a good idea to have on. Make sure it's disabled. Then for sprint view shake, put this on minimal. We want our head bobbing to be as minimal as possible as we move around, so we are not losing any visibility whilst we're moving quickly around the map. For VSync, definitely put this to disabled. This is going to give you the lowest input latency possible. I know that VSync does help with screen tearing, as it shows on the right there, but it also says that because it's taking a bit more time for your actions to appear on screen, you're increasing the input lag. It's going to make this game feel way more sluggish than we want to, so ensure that this is disabled. Then NVIDIA Reflex. You want to either have this at enabled or enabled plus boost. It doesn't explain in here what the difference is, so I'll explain it here. Enabled plus boost is for any of you guys who have GPUs that are considerably stronger or newer than your CPU, which is a lot of us gamers. A lot of us gamers put a lot more of our money into our GPUs. If you're in that scenario, you want to use enabled plus boost. However, in my scenario, and it might be your scenario as well, my CPU and GPU are both kind of even, or at least my CPU isn't an old CPU. So for me, enabled is better. If you don't know which scenario you're in, try both out and see if one feels better for you or the other. Just make sure you don't have it to disabled. Adaptive resolution FPS target, bring this all the way down to 0. You'll see that adaptive super sampling disables itself completely when we do that. Adaptive resolution makes it so that it varies your resolution to maintain a certain FPS. Not something we want to be using. We don't want our resolution changing on the fly. That's going to affect our input latency, and it's going to make our game look potentially blurry in certain situations. No, definitely keep that off. And then anti-aliasing. Very annoying in this game. We only have one anti-aliasing option, which is TSAA. And unfortunately, on most setups, it kind of looks blurry. What anti-aliasing does is it removes a lot of the sort of jagged edges and shimmering on objects through different methods. the method in this game, unfortunately, is quite blurry, so I would actually recommend that you run this at none. You'll see it really crisps up your image a ton. It just can add some of those jagged edges on objects, but there's no current way to fix that. Then we've got your texture streaming budget. If you are super sweaty and you want to get the best theoretical FPS possible, then bring this down to low. Don't go to very low, because it looks horrendous and you really don't gain performance going from low to very low. Low looks considerably better, and the performance is exactly the same. But for most people who are just playing the game even slightly casually, or even who are playing it kind of competitively but have decent builds, I wouldn't go lower than probably very high. 6 gig of VRAM, most people have got that on their cards, and as long as you've got the VRAM to support the texture streaming budget, this setting does not have an effect on FPS really at all. I actually run this at Ultra because I want the game to look as good as possible. It also tends to help with visibility, I find, being able to differentiate surfaces based on their textures. It's a bit of personal preference. Take what I've said there and run with what you want them. For your texture filtering, it says turning this down will reduce GPU load. Honestly, turn this all the way up. Anisotropic filtering has little to no effect on FPS whatsoever in pretty much any game these days. It's a really lightweight but effective way to just gain overall visual fidelity and overall visibility in every single game. People who are turning this down to bilinear to get the best FPS possible, I think it's stupid. Just turn this up. Ambient occlusion, you want to make sure that this is disabled. This is going to add in loads of shadows in loads of corners and stuff to make the game look a bit more realistic, but it does overall affect visibility. It gives enemies actually some darker areas to hide in when you're playing, which is not good, so definitely make sure that's disabled. And then pretty much everything from here down you want to make sure is on the lowest or off settings. So sun shadow coverage low, sun shadow detail low, spot shadow detail disabled, volumetric lighting definitely disable that. That's a pretty hefty one on FPS. Dynamic spot shadows disabled, and then low, disabled, low. The only thing I'll touch on in here is impact marks. If you want to practice your recoil by shooting at a wall, for example, in the training range, I come over here, I have to turn this up in order to get the bullet marks on the wall. You'll see if I turn this back down to disabled, which is what I'd recommend you do for the actual game, and I shoot this wall, no bullet holes appear. So it becomes harder to actually practice my sprays. Just a little bit of info there. Moving on to the audio quickly, there's nothing in here really that's going to help footstep audio or anything like that in Apex, so the only thing I'd recommend you do is just get rid of the music. The music is pretty awesome in Apex, but it's overall just going to be a distraction, so turn it off. And lastly, for the in-game stuff, I've got a couple of recommendations in the gameplay settings. Crosshair damage feedback, I would highly recommend that you turn this off. The simple reason why you don't need essentially hit markers in Apex is because you get the numbers, so you know that you're hitting people. You also get some really nice audio feedback, so having those big X's appear in front of your screen, it's just a bit more of a distraction. In some of those frantic gunfights, it can affect visibility, so most people do run those off. Button hints, if you're newer to the game, keep those on. If you're used to the game, you can turn those off, and it just cleans up the HUD a bit overall, which is nice. I'd highly recommend you turn the interact prompt style from default to compact. Once again, if you're newer to the game, having these big pop-ups can be helpful because then you know what you're looking at, but as soon as you get used to that, put it on compact and you turn it down to this nice little box. It's not going to suddenly cover up an enemy that's coming around a corner because you're looking at loot on the floor. For your damage numbers, I'd recommend either stacking or both. The reason you don't want to just do floating is because you don't get an idea of your total damage that you've done to an enemy. You see, if I come over here and I start shooting this guy, I just get loads of individual numbers flying off. But then if someone says to me, how much damage did you do to him? I have no idea. Whereas if I put this to stacking and I do, you know, and then I start shooting this guy, I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I can say I've done 104 damage, so I have an idea of how much health he has left. Really important for the fight. If you put it on both, you just get both of those. You get the individual damage numbers and the total damage, which is nice. So you can see the individual numbers coming off. It gives you a good feedback, I guess, if you're hitting the head and getting those critical hits, but you also get the overall number. So Either, both, or stacking, it's personal preference. Ping opacity, make sure that's on faded so that pings don't get in the way. Obituaries, turn them on. It will let you know who is dying and who's getting kills in the game. It can be helpful to track what's going on in the game as you're playing. You've got your performance display down here. If you want to turn this on, this will give you your FPS and stuff on the right, as well as your ping, so you can check if you're lagging. Very nice to have on usually, just to know if there's anything going wrong with your system or your internet. Incoming damage feedback, put this on 2D, much better for visibility overall, and you still get a really good idea of where you've been shot from to make a decision of how you're going to play out the fight. And the only other thing I will mention in here is reticle. You can customize it here. Currently, I like to run it at a teal color, which is sort of this color. That works out nicely for me. As you can see, it's just nice and bold against enemies. Next thing you want to do is close your game and come over to your launcher that you launch Apex from. Mine is Steam. You guys might still be running from the EA app or Origin or whatever it's called. Either way, you should be able to right click the game and find a properties area. Probably will be the same in the EA app or Origin side of things. And you want to find your launch options. You want to put in these 3 launch options. I'll have them down in the description so you can just copy and paste them. Dash novid, this just makes it so that the video that pops up, the respawn logo, it won't be there when you load up the game, so you can load into game a bit quicker. Really helpful if you disconnect or something like that, or you just want to get on the game a bit quicker. Dash full screen, this might not be necessary, but it just ensures that every time you come on the game, you don't accidentally end up on windowed full screen or something and you don't realize, which, as I've already said, would affect your input latency. This makes sure you're forcing proper full screen every time you come on the game. And then you want to add plus exec space AutoExec. What this is going to do is it's going to make an executable config file that we're going to add in just a minute. It's going to make that activate when we load in to Apex. To get that AutoExec, we need to go to where the game is installed. So in Steam, you can go to installed files and then click on browse to go to the installation folder. Once again, there should be a way to do this through Origin or EA app. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but just get yourself to your area where Apex is installed, just like this. Then you're going to go to config or CFG, this folder. Inside of this folder, you might see nothing, or you might see a couple of files if you've done this kind of thing before. Either way, I'd recommend you start fresh. Come in here, right click, go to new text document. Call it AutoExec, make sure it matches what we put in our launch options. Then you're going to open it up, and I'll have a link in the description below that will take you to an AutoExec that's made by a guy called Complies. I'll have a link to his YouTube channel as well. He does a load of Apex Legends stuff, including Apex Legends settings as well. But he has an AutoExec that a lot of people I know have used. You just need to go and copy all of that stuff, which I will do now. So you can see here, I've copied this all in. There's loads and loads of lines of stuff here. A lot of this is historical, and a lot of this, honestly, doesn't actually do too much, but it doesn't have any bad effect either, so you may as well just have it all in here in case it helps. Key really important things in here: CL FOV scale 1.7. This is what is going to push your FOV to 120. I'm going to show you this in game after I've shown you these config files to prove that this is actually kicking in a higher FOV than you can reach in game. We've also got the bind of F12, which will exec your AutoExec. This is helpful because if you ever mess around with any of your settings in game and you just want to have your AutoExec kick in again, you can just press F12 on your keyboard and it will run this whole file essentially and get you back up to speed with everything we've set in here. For your FPS max, as it says here, you can change this to whatever you want. There did used to be this high FPS stutter bug, so you basically had to cap your FPS at, I think, 160, but that doesn't exist anymore. You can run a lot higher FPS. For me, I have a 240 Hertz monitor, so I just cap it at 240. I don't need to go over that, but set whatever you want your FPS cap to be here. In general, you want to set it around the kind of FPS you can consistently hit. That way, you don't get loads of fluctuating up and down FPS. You just have a nice, solid FPS, solid input latency, and the game will feel as good as possible. When you're done with this file, you want to click File, Save As. Make sure you're in the same folder that we were in before. Click Save As Type. Get rid of all files, and then you just want to remove the .txt from the end and instead have .cfg. Now, I'm not going to click save because I already have this file set up, but if you do that correctly, you should end up having an AutoExec.cfg file in the CFG folder that will automatically execute when you load up Apex Legends. The last change we're going to make is to our video settings config file. To get there, you want to come down to your search bar and type in saved games. Oh, save games. There we go. You're going to click here. You're then going to go to respawn, because obviously they're the people who make Apex, then Apex, then local. And in here, you will have a video config.txt file. We're only going to make 3 lines of change in here. Scroll all the way down. There's these 3 settings here, which are these CSM settings. This is all to do with shadows, which are pretty costly on input latency and on FPS. By default, these might be set to anything that isn't 0. Just change them to 0. When you've done that, you're going to save the file here. And to make sure that they don't change when we go in game, you're going to right click, you're going to go to properties, and you're going to ensure that read only is checked. It won't be checked for you guys by default. It will just be like this. You want to check it, you want to click apply, and this way this video config is going to be locked in. Keep in mind, if you want to make any changes to your video settings in-game, you will need to come and untick the read-only thing here first to make sure you can lock in those new settings. Then come back here afterwards, make it read-only, make it apply, and then you'll be all sorted. So I'm back in game here one final time to prove the 120 FOV is real that we set in that file. What I've done is I've set my FOV to 90 to begin with. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it to 110. That's the max we can get in game. You can see here now my FOV has widened. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up these 2 boxes with the edges of my screen. So we just have a bit of a reference point like that, okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down, I'm going to press F12 on my keyboard, which was the binding we set in the AutoExec to execute the file. When I press that, I take a screenshot of the game because that's also the Steam screenshot, but you'll see I've gained that little bit of FOV. And that little bit of FOV is incredibly useful. I have so much vision now when I'm moving around. I feel like I'm moving incredibly quickly. It will also mean that enemies are a little smaller on the screen, which some people won't like. So you have to pick and choose, see what you like the most. I think 120 FOV is 100% worth it. So now that you've got all of your in-game settings and your config files set up, the next thing I'd recommend you do is watch this video where I take you guys through the best NVIDIA control panel settings for any game, not just Apex Legends. Once again, to push your FPS that little bit further and even further reduce that input latency for the best experience possible.